Hello, everyone, and welcome to a severely delayed episode of Relating to DevSecOps, number 61, where we continue to explore the development, security, and operations issues of today so we can solve real-world problems with people that face them. I'm your host, Ken Toller, and I'm joined again by Mike, and we are back in the saddle here. We've had a whirlwind of issues and problems, and apologies for the camera quality for those of you watching, but we are kicking it back into gear here after a few weeks. Mike, how are things on your end in your world?
I think much better than your world. I have no water in my basement or workers tearing everything up. So,
Yes, my floors have been upended. Um, there's a drain under. Someone put a drain under wood flooring, so that's new. You know, things you discover as you tear away at old buildings. So in that, you know what? In that theme, let's talk about draining old things away in application and cloud security and in DevSecOps. We're kicking it off with talking about how to address legacy applications and really just living in the real world, right?
hmm
Right? Just like facing things that everyone faces. I think in this day and age, we're talking about all the cool new stuff, AI, and even to some degree cloud and automation and all of these things that push us into the new wave of application and cloud security. But Mike, you and I have both recently been faced with organizations that have been around for a while, maybe have some old applications or old workloads that haven't been fully migrated, or are we've addressed some of this early in the podcast around organizations that still use like mainframes or are really have varying generations of technology. And so I think a good topic is how to address that when you're sort of inundated with all of this new stuff, and how to gain visibility in the application and how to have a good SDLC and all these kinds of things. And then there's just these glaring boils on the rear ends of of software development teams. Do you have a lot of experience yourself recently in facing those types of legacy applications? And if so, I guess how do you define them, or what do you do besides cry when you first see these things pop up?
yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have any super recent examples, but I have plenty. I've reviewed enough old Java code to fill a lifetime. So, plenty of examples of issues I've seen and just architectures and apps that make it so hard to make progress in security. We think about when you do a security review of a modern app and you find, say, cross-site scripting or SQL injection, something like that, and you say just use this function to encode or use this, ORM to do your SQL query, and you're going to solve the issue. And devs are like, oh yeah, that's easy, 10-minute fix, and we're good. When you get into the legacy world, it's like, oh, if we change how that SQL query works, that slows down our app by 30%, and Jeff, the data guy, will kill someone. So we can't touch that SQL query. So find another solution. Or, if we try to output and code every single thing in our app, it's going to take 6 months worth of work. So it's just like it's a different beast when you work with more legacy applications. And I think Java developers are just less happy people. And that's understandable.
Yeah. I mean, not just Java though. I think it's even Python applications, or now Rails applications, Ruby applications that are on old versions. I think we have this interesting cycle where engineers and teams and organizations move on to the next thing, or are even starting at the next generation of new technology that provide a lot of these things out of the box, and leave some of the older legacy applications behind to go and move on to that because it's like the next new thing. And So I think what I've really thought of legacy um, being like, C applications or even .NET to some degree, like old .NET apps or Java, like you said. I've seen, some of these organizations use old versions of stuff that was modern, for me coming up in security and now have become sort of legacy issues where you go, wow, people still use this stuff and are still making these mistakes. So it's not
Yeah.
even just old Java applications. It can really be just old versions of Rails or old versions of Ruby.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's definitely true. And I think I haven't seen as many issues with the basics with like those types of apps here and there. Sometimes you might see it with architectures, but um, you definitely run into issues with complexity with large monolithic apps that even if they're Rails, Python, anything, you're going to run into complexity issues eventually. I actually feel like some of those when people build in like if they build like a Flask app or a Flask type of application, then that scales up to be crazy large. That's actually worse than actually having like a full-on framework that you use for model view controller as it gets bigger because there's at least some structure to it versus like when people just use straight up Node and build their own kind of ghetto MVC, things just become so much more complex to solve. But
Yeah. And I think the other thing to think about is you mentioned it, like I can't remember who it was, but Bob, the data guy or whatever,
Jeff,
oh,
remember
Jeff.
his name?
Sorry, Jeff. You know, th- that's if they're still around. I think the other thing in legacy apps is entire development teams are gone. You know,
Yeah,
no, and folks are just sort of afraid to touch the code. So even if you identify issues, it's kind of like, do we risk breaking the application, or is there something we can sort of bolt on to solve the problem in the, and I'll put it in air quotes, the short term, which eventually just becomes the forever term for some of these legacy applications that just exacerbates the problem until you can get folks off. So in that vein, when you're faced with these legacy applications, let's just take the worst possible example, which is, maybe something in an older language, monolithic application has been developed by a team that isn't around anymore. You have a new team working on new stuff. Nobody wants to touch it, and it's this sort of glaring security hole in your organization. What would you say is the first step in your mind of tackling this application? Let's just say it's a 500,000 lines of code.
I mean, I think it goes back to you need to speak in the developer's language. I think one of the things that security people struggle with is they run some tooling, they find cross-site scripting, they say fix this, and then developers have to figure out how to fix it. And like I talked about before, sometimes with these apps, it's way more complex than you would think to fix something. So I think the first thing you have to do is understand how the application actually works. So you can work with the developers to say, okay, here is where you fix the issue, here's how you fix the issue, here's, you know, there's so many times where developers go to fix cross-site scripting issues. I'm just using that as an example, but there's tons of other issues, and it becomes whack-a-mole where they're like, okay, I put a regex there. If you put in script, you can't enter cross-site scripting payloads. Then you add a different like on image source or something like that. You add a new type of um, payload, and that bypasses their filter, and you, like just go back and forth over and over. Um, so I think you have to understand how the application works and how to develop a very tailored solution to that issue in that application. And that goes for authentication, authorization, anything, not just cross-site scripting. That's just an obvious example that we see a lot. Um, so I think, yeah, you have to understand it to a pretty deep level. So that means getting into the code, understanding the architecture, understanding the data flows, and being able to speak to it as if you were a developer of the app. That's my view, at least.
Yeah. So that's like the technical review. So I think, obviously we have to at least take some time to understand what it is we're looking at. But given the people side, the people centric um, element of DevSecOps, and knowing that when we have these applications, that no one is really motivated to understand the application and they want to figure this out, what are some techniques that you would maybe use to try to get 70 to 100% of that view? And to give you an example, if I'm looking at this 500,000 lines of code, it's like you've got the architecture to think about. You've got the upstream and downstream dependencies of this application, which is probably not, you know, um, evaluated in any modern sense. There's probably not an agent or any kind of application introspection. You're probably going to have to dig through this code. That's going to take time. Maybe you're the first person to actually care about looking and understanding this code from start to finish. So, what are the big brushstrokes you might take to understand an application or to get at least most of what you need to make some decisions on how to tackle it?
I mean, I think obviously knowing what framework and language it is the first part, and then understanding the architecture. If it is an API driven application, or if it's an MVC monolith, understanding how authentication works. Like, are you using some kind of identity service outside of your actual application that handles identity and authentication? Then you have some sessions between them. How do you deal with databases or data stores? What are your data stores? Is it all just backed by a database? Is there a data layer? Where does this sit in your network? What's the kind of the cloud or network infrastructure look like behind the application? And I think even understanding kind of the CI/CD workflows, if they are using CI/CD, hopefully they're not sending zip files. Someone did send me a zip file of code the other day, and I was like, yes, the 90s are back.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean,
But
good advice in there. So let me see if I can summarize correctly. Like, what's the dev approach? So how is this MVC? Is this functional? Is this just raw APIs? Is there any structure to the code at all that you can look at? If it's something like Rails or if it's a framework, identify what that is so that like by convention, how this stuff works, so it can help you sort of tackle the code in big chunks as opposed to having to read through every line. So, do you have a views folder? Is there a models folder? Like, how does this framework actually work? Take some time to read that documentation if it still exists. Understanding, databases and configuration files, because a lot of these haven't gone through CI/CD, so there are weaknesses in configuration files, passwords and secrets and things like that
yeah,
that you're
that's a
gonna
good
like
that's a
uncover
good
very,
call
very
out. Yeah.
early. And then yeah, I kind of laughed about the CI/CD thing because sometimes these things are just up and running. it's
Yeah.
like and it's like, yeah, we've just created state files or snapshots of these things. So if anything happens, we're just going to try to restart it.
Yeah.
So it's stuff like that. But very yeah, I agree. Just sort of getting those architectural understandings of how things fit together before you start diving into code. That way, you're focused in on where stuff exists. Also, things I want to add are just look for comments. A lot of
Mm.
times especially in these older applications or distributed applications, there are just comments around what security holes exist, stuff that's left to do, ticket references that are probably untouched or maybe don't exist anymore. And so you can sort of do some information discovery through comment hunting. So
Hmm.
you can get a lot out of that. I think one thing that you sort of touched on was understanding what security controls exist external to the application, because that can sometimes be an indicator of what you're trying to protect against. So like, is there a load balancer in front that's doing something weird? Is there some sort of crunchy shell around this thing that you can sort of focus on in terms of upstream and downstream dependencies that's handling things that maybe the application doesn't handle. That way you can sort of see what it's touching and where the network traffic is going. And you can sometimes, especially if you have like network logs or you're pulling in flow logs or something, you can start to identify, okay, where is this thing going or how is it touching
Hmm.
other aspects, which sort of brings me to the next question, which is, if you're getting this lay of the land, how do you, in a world where it's obviously going to take you, if you were to hire a firm to do something that's like a 500,000 lines of code on a legacy application, it's probably going to take them what, 4 to 6 weeks? Would you say that's a fair estimate?
Half a
Um,
million lines of code.
yeah, like if they were just like, hey, we want like a gray box assessment of just of this application to get as much as we can to
Hmm.
understand what the risk profile is. Probably like 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that. What do you think?
If you want a real deep dive, then yeah, probably.
Yeah. So in a world where you're like, I need to sort of start moving on this thing within 2 to 3 weeks, how do you look at the risk profile of those types of applications, and what are the things you're looking for to give you enough information to say, hey, like we need to focus on these areas of this app or not? You mentioned things like auth and config and things like that. Like
Yeah,
how do you get your top list?
there's something that Ken Johnson and Seth Law, their training they talk about, which is like, don't even too often, because we all love finding bugs, we all love finding SQL injection, something like that. That's like our goal during the assessment, so we love focusing on that. But they talk about don't go down the rabbit hole too early. So don't start like, oh, here's a potential SQL injection issue. Let me follow this through. Let me look at all the logic. Let me understand how it handles the data for this one thing. Let me start and understand the application first. So, like, if you're bug hunting, if you have 500,000 lines of code and you're bug hunting in the first week, I think that's probably the wrong approach. You need to spend some time to understand the application. So, what are the libraries in use? Is it using a authentication or authorization library? Um, again, what framework, what ORM, if it's using one. Like you said, the notes and the comments are always interesting. I love that screenshot that's going around that is, this doesn't do anything, but whenever we remove it, the application breaks, so don't touch it. It's like an old one from Stack Overflow, I think. But I think all those things are good. The config files are always interesting too, from both the secrets perspective, but also just there's usually some interesting information of why something is the way that it is in those. Um, so I think understanding that from a high level, understanding those high points, how data flows through it, um, and I think after that, I don't, we don't use a huge amount of automated tools, but sometimes the tools will help you see kind of hotspots of where code issues are. Even if they're false positives, they might point you in a direction that would be interesting later on to say like, okay, it's using MD5 here, and maybe that's not an issue because it's not an actual security usage of MD5, but it points you to other areas in that might be of concern. So I've often found running some tools once you're familiar with the app is a good way to at least find some bad areas of the application, especially if you're talking about 500,000 lines of code. So um, I think that's learning the app is like your first week or two, and then you start bug hunting. But I don't
Yeah.
know. What do you see things differently?
I don't know if I'd say differently. I think you covered pretty well the technical side of things, of assessing the general security risk of the application. But as you're talking, I was thinking, um, one of the things that I would typically do, especially if you're working either with a client or you're internal, to understand, I understand that this application is legacy. It's obviously important to the business, but what is it actually doing?
Hmm.
So not even from like an application perspective, but what business function or business operation do you expect out of this application? What is it delivering that's so valuable? Because I think some of the things you touched on, like what data is it handling and how is it handling it, and where is it going and what is it touching, and what are the like authentication and configuration, all that kind of stuff is really, those are just tools to get you to a point where you say, okay, what is the what effect would it have if any of this information was compromised or the server was compromised and it could touch the things that it touches? So if you understand like what data you're handling, then like what am I at legal risk for?
Hmm.
What are these things that I care about? Are are these session tokens? Is this somebody's personal information? Is this, business confidential information? Like, where does this fit in your data classification? So that helps. Two
Yeah.
is like understanding what these things connect to means like if we're looking at something like attack framework, or you're considering what the attack path is, if an attacker has like full control of the system, let's just assume, what do they have access to and where can they go? And if you can sort of help, if any of those answers to the question sort of pull you back in risk, it's super helpful to be able to say, well, I can probably isolate this for a little bit if it's low data risk, even though it's high security risk. Or, and I'm not saying that's the perfect solution for everything, but it just helps you set your priorities, because one of the things we love to do in security is to sort of showcase and shame like all the bad things that people are doing, but we're also complaining about staff shortages and how we don't have enough people and like we can't do it all and all these kinds of things. So, naturally we have to prioritize bad things against other bad things. And I think we don't really talk often enough about how to do that when you have a lot of critically bad stuff and not enough people to work through it. Like you can't just shut down and go and fix these things. So I think it's being responsible and aware of what you're doing when. And I think what I want to get out of this conversation is how do we do that? How can we make the bad things marginally better, especially if we're surrounded by all bad stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I feel like we've talked about security absolutism before, as in like, it's either completely secure or it's nothing, and that's just like that's not the reality. It's not the reality often of being able to say, you know, have the perfect solution to the security issue, um, or don't do anything at all. Like we have to find happy mediums of solving some risk without taking down the payment application that was written in the 90s but processes millions of dollars a day. And
Yeah.
if it breaks, the business gets sued by their customer, something like that. So, um,
Security absolutism. Bury your servers and bury your business. That'll be it, right?
yeah,
That's
become a farmer.
yeah. Even then.
Yeah, Azure has a farming service, so it's coming for
Hey,
farming too.
it's coming. Well, you got
Yeah,
connected IoT tractors,
I know, it's
you're
crazy.
you're all it's all kinds of stuff. So,
Yeah,
all right, back to the drain. Back to the topic.
yeah, but I mean, yeah, I think you have to go into it, and it goes back to understanding at a technical level how these things work, so you can find a solution that works, and maybe in the short term it's moderating, reducing the risk, 25%, and then you say, okay, we're going to do this now, and then in the future we're going to do this. And I'm not suggesting necessarily like a lot of times people talk about like WAFs in front of web applications to solve things, to say like, okay, we're what do they call it, virtual patching. We don't actually solve the issue in the code, but we throw a WAF in front of it. And I don't think that's a terrible solution, but I feel like the only problem with that is people are like, all right, well, now our pen testers, our internal team can't exploit that issue. We're good. We're good enough,
Yeah,
And
we're
then
we're
someone
done.
turns off the WAF in 6 months, or they move to a different like ALB in front of it that doesn't have a WAF on, and yeah. So I think you have to find those solutions, and the short term and the long term, and work with the business. So security works for the business. The business doesn't work for security. So
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember what I was listening to another podcast. It may have been, I can't remember. I'll have to put in the show notes, but they were saying, security generally is a revenue protection function,
hmm
you know, and while we like to talk about security in the context of like black and white, or um, just being like an absolutist, or making sure that something is secure or not secure and sort of rolling our eyes at everything, at the end of the day, we are trying to protect businesses, and the most secure systems
hmm
are obviously the ones that don't exist or are buried or off or whatever. And so I think that we don't really have that conversation enough. So I'm interested to see if we have any comments or pushes in terms of how to approach this stuff, because I think it's something that organizations tackle all the time. We're constantly looking at things like FAIR or security frameworks or ways to look at organizations at a high level to try to protect this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think when you bring up risk to decision makers, executives in a company, they're not looking at it just from a security perspective. They look at it from the holistic view. And maybe you could say some companies are too heavy on the financial, like, okay, this would affect revenue now,
Hmm.
so we can't deal with it. Let's just kick the can. Um, and that's I think that's a fair criticism in certain places, and that usually bites people in the long term. Um, but I mean, I think you have to present it overall. And again, like we're such a tool driven industry that we use our tools to find things, and then everything is kind of ratcheted up on the risk higher than it probably should be. And so you have all these things you're always reporting about high risk issues that aren't really couched in what is the actual risk. If it's your recruiting website that just has job postings on it and it has a cross-site scripting, is that a critical that they need to shut down the website today? Is that like, does an executive need to know about that today, or is it something that can be fixed in the short term, but not, shut down a critical part of the business, things like that. So I think we always talk about being better communicators, I think, in security, and being able to explain what the risk of things really are. And then I think always having a solution. Like if you have a problem, have a solution. Don't just call out a problem. Like say, here's the risk, here's what could happen if it goes wrong, here's what I think you should do to solve it, short term and long term.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't want this to come across as like revenue is the is the end all be all of assessing risk, but I think that it is helpful to have some. We talk about like you look at severity ratings or risk ratings in some of these documents when you're looking at an application, and it'll be like critical severity has significant impact on the business at a critical level, high severity, high level. And you're like, okay, this is all very like arbitrary, it's subjective. So when we
Yeah.
talk about impact or severity or impact as a variable to the overall severity or criticality of an issue or an application, it needs to have some tie-in to what the business cares about. So, if it is your data classification policy plus the revenue impact plus, the brand damage or whatever it might be, like that has to be in your criticality ratings when you're looking at things because you need at least, I mean, some sort of pseudo even objective metric to measure these things against each other, or you'll never progress because you're basically fighting one person's idea of severity versus another person's idea of severity, and you're just sort of operating. You're kind of um, making things like just a subjective competition on how to risk rate stuff, and it reminds me of this. I saw somebody's data classification policy. I saw, and it was like, um, what were the words? It was like it's a qualitative analysis on how to quantify risk. I was like, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, And so it's stuff like that, and it's just because the folks are trying to wrap their heads around like we don't know what to do. We're just trying to get some sort of idea around it. So I think if I had to summarize that rambling, it would be pick things in your organization that you can find that matter to people, whether that is the type of data, it's the data classification, it's the revenue, it's the whatever path to exploit, or does an exploit exist for this thing? Like use all of these things to help you drive what your risk rating is, rather than use these generic vague terms that you find in policies and standards that meet quote compliance. Because if you don't, then you're not gonna have any guide or assistance to make these decisions, and you have no way to sort of get on an equilibrium with everyone. So, stuff like that I think is like where I want to go with like the legacy apps is, first define what you are measuring your risk with. have the conversations with product, have the conversations with the executive team, have the conversations with your engineers, and figure out what everyone like cares about, or from a security perspective, and then help that to inform the decision on like what you do about these applications. Because once you get all that information, the business functions and how it connects to other stuff, you will have nothing to measure it against if you don't have those conversations first.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Have you seen in either companies you've worked with or consulted with, like there you mentioned things like FAIR, which is supposed to bring in like what is the revenue impact of this process or system, whatever it is, and then have that be part of the risk rating. I think the only issue I see with those is it slows down the process for judging these things. Like risk and compliance move much slower than developers and technical security people in the sense of we're constantly finding issues. And I know you have some personal experience with this. If you spend 6 months arguing over one issue of how high the risk is and what the solution should be, like 50 more things have popped up that need to be addressed. You will be in that circle forever. So have you seen more rapid, more rapid processes for doing more than just like a CVSS and having more of that enriched data, but also not being a 6 month process?
I've seen people talk about it, and I think um, I can't remember, but I was doing a talk recently at the Modern CISO Summit where they did discuss this, and they talked about this exact issue. So I have to go back and look at what the framework was, and I can put it into the show notes and maybe follow up on this. But it was but they talked about FAIR, and one of the things that they mentioned is exactly what you're saying, which is you have this quantitative analysis, but it takes you down this rabbit hole that gets you to these conversations with the board that help you quantify risk and show all these metrics and the data in terms of how you make decisions. Um, but at the end of the day, you have to go through all these rigorous processes, and the ship is sailing. It is you
Mm-hmm.
have to get to a fast way to make these decisions. And one of the other comments that came up is that CISOs, when they're talking about this to the board, like to make these decisions in terms of what to do, like this legacy application, ultimately what's going to happen is you are competing in security with initiatives for the business. So the board needs to understand, or the leadership needs to understand what this risk is. And if you try to explain it in all of these sort of quantitative analysis, it has to have some data driven decision making. But at the same time, you don't want to lose non technical folks, especially if you don't have a technical board. So there's this dance that you have to play politically and in the business side where these aren't security experts or even technical experts necessarily. They just want to know what's going to be best for the business. And so how do you do that? So when you go through all this FAIR analysis, even that is so complex that sometimes this doesn't make sense to folks you are presenting the end result to.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is part of, you know, when you are deciding on how to assess risk, it needs to be within the context of the business and what that business is going to understand. So if it's fair and you have, maybe that works for you and everybody's behind it. But if they're not, then you're just sort of like on this lonely island trying to create quantitative analysis around risk. And you have trouble with it because maybe the business doesn't understand how much a an end user is actually worth, and they just have a sort of an idea about it. And so if you can't get that information, then garbage in, garbage out, you're not going to really come up with a good plan. So there's this mix of like gut checks and stuff. I really have to look at it because the CISOs that were talking about it were still sort of experimenting with it, and it was more of a subjective approach. I guess maybe that document I read was right, and maybe it is a qualitative analysis to quantify risk. I don't know, but it's just trying to find that middle ground. So I think that you need to have hard numbers on something to help with that, but it's very difficult to get the complete picture. And I think this is an issue. I mean, we've been fighting for years, right? No one has really truly figured some general or generic approach to this that works for everyone. And I
Hmm.
think that it's just because there's so much that goes into it that is unique to each business.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we always have the issue of overrating things and competing. If you report 10 criticals, which one is the most critical? It just becomes noise. I love the office quote where the employees are complaining that Michael Scott labels every email critical, but he says, no, I label them critical A, or like critical one, critical two, critical three, and
Yeah.
critical three you can just ignore. But it's kind of the same thing. It's like if Heartbleed was a CVSS 10, and there's like thousands of more CVSS 10s, how are they at all comparable? Some of those
Yeah.
aren't even exploitable. So, yeah, I mean, I think we definitely have a risk communication issue in our industry. So it's definitely something to solve. We're way off the beaten path from
Yeah.
legacy
I mean,
applications,
I
which
don't
is
think we're
so
too,
typical for.
yeah, I don't think we're too far off. I mean, talking about sort of quantitative versus qualitative risk analysis and how to look at a legacy application through that lens to give you some sort of path to success in terms of figuring out what to do. Um, I mean, I think that that's good. The reason that we're, I think, focusing on this is we've both seen like how often people waffle or just flounder on what to do. And these tools, I think it's like, everyone is facing this problem, and I think that exposure of that is valuable.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe next time we get into like maybe comparing some of that stuff, or we can talk about just just figuring out what was the security absolutism topic could be next. So look out for that. Bury your applications, bury your business. I feel like that's a podcast episode name that will just carry itself.
Yeah,
Any
it'll be
final
good.
words on risk analysis, legacy applications, how to tackle these things that you want to cover before we sign off at the 30-minute mark? I think we captured ears for long enough.
No, I mean, I think we summarized it pretty well. Do you want to talk about the trainings we have coming up?
Yeah, definitely. If you've stuck around for this, Mike and I have a great training workshop coming up in October at LastCon 2023. What are the dates for that? It's a pre-conference training. We will be talking about Terraform, getting you built up on using using Terraform plans, building a Terraform state, and then also some of the implementation weaknesses that we've seen over the last few years in terms of remote code execution in Terraform, exploiting that, and showing you not only how to exploit it, but then how to defend against it on the tail end. Over the course
Yeah.
of 2 days with us live and in action.
Yes. If you can't get enough of us remotely, come see us in person. But I think it is an interesting training. We've done a lot of talking about it, and it's good for red teamers who want to use Terraform exploits in their work, and it's good for blue teamers who want to build defenses around, cloud pipelines, which is a big risk area. So it's definitely going to be a good training.
Yep. So keep an eye out for that and sign up if you can. We'll drop the link in the show notes for that too. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.